What's something your parents believe that you don't?
You know that gut punch when you see something you can't unsee, like your own family unraveling right before your eyes, and suddenly you're knee-deep in a mess that could drown everything you thought you knew. Which is exactly what happened to me one crisp autumn evening by Willow Lake when I watched my daughter-in-law Lisa heave a suitcase into the water like it was yesterday's trash. Figuring at first it was just her dramatic way of clearing out old junk from their marriage, since every couple has their blow-ups, but then that faint muffled thump from inside hit like a heartbeat trapped in there, making me realize I had to act before it was too late, and what I pulled out changed our family forever, though getting there involved a tangled path full of secrets, stumbles, and a few darn satisfying comeuppances along the way that kept me questioning every step. I never imagined my golden years would unfold into some kind of backyard detective escapade, especially not after Tom, my only son, pushing 40 with his easy grin and a construction job that kept him out until dark most days building homes for folks who dreamed of the stability we Harlans had always chased. Brought Lisa home 5 years ago as this whirlwind of a woman 20 years his junior, complete with sharp eyes that seemed to appraise everything around her and a laugh ringing a bit too loud as if she were always selling something you didn't quite ask for, turning what used to be peaceful summers at the old cabin my late husband Frank and I inherited near Willow Creek in Wisconsin into a pressure cooker of unspoken gripes bubbling just below the surface ever since he passed 10 years back from that sudden heart issue nobody saw coming, leaving behind not just grief, but the lingering shadow of his hardware store's collapse under bad debts that still whispered through our lives like wind through the pines. It all started small the way these family frictions often do, with Lisa glued to her phone during those communal dinners where we'd gather around the scarred oak table laden with fresh-caught fish or my potato casserole, whispering into it as though plotting some grand scheme instead of merely checking emails from her real estate work in town that she claimed kept her so tied up, and I'd catch her slipping out to the dock on those humid evenings, pacing back and forth while muttering about debts we couldn't shake off no matter how hard Tom worked to square things away, which made my ears perk up because Frank's gambling habits had left us scraping by even after the insurance money trickled in, and Tom had sworn to me over and over that he'd handled the last of it without pulling me into the worry. One lazy afternoon while she was off on one of her endless errands, always accompanied by that secretive smile that set my teeth on edge, I decided to tidy the guest room where they crashed during visits not out of outright snooping, but the practical habit of a mother-in-law keeping things shipshape, only to discover tucked under the bed a small velvet box containing an antique gold necklace the kind Frank had given me for our 20th anniversary before he started pawning our savings to prop up his failing business. And my stomach twisted into knots wondering how on earth that heirloom had ended up in her possession since she brushed off my direct question later with wide-eyed innocence, claiming it was just a flea market score, though her fidgeting fingers betrayed the lie as clearly as the mismatched clasp that didn't quite match the original. Humor became my way of coping with the absurdity of it all, because watching your grown son tie himself to a woman who eyed your family treasures like they were bargains at a yard sale was enough to make me chuckle bitterly into my morning coffee alone on the porch swing, joking with the neighbors over fence chats about how Lisa was spicing up the Harlan recipe with a dash of mystery that nobody ordered, yet deep down that uncertainty gnawed at me relentlessly, especially when Tom dismissed my concerns with his standard tired refrain of "Mom, she's just stressed from the market slump," like I was the overreacting widow projecting my own past heartaches onto their so-called fresh start, leaving me to stew during those long twilight hours on the porch where fireflies danced mockingly as if they held all the answers to the fridge emptying faster than usual, or Lisa's habit of dodging any real talk about their city apartment's upkeep. The real simmer reached a boil during that 4th of July barbecue when the air hung thick with the sizzle of burgers on the grill and the smoky aroma that evoked every classic American summer memory from my own childhood cookouts, drawing in the whole neighborhood, including old Mrs. Jenkins from next door with her infamous potato salad that stuck to your ribs like it was made with glue, and Lisa put on her best show charming everyone with tales of snagging lakefront deals that sounded too good to be true while I observed her slip away midway through the festivities, phone clutched tightly as she headed toward the tree line with shoulders hunched in obvious tension. prompting my curiosity to override common sense, so I trailed at a discreet distance, heart pounding like I was starring in one of those gripping crime dramas Tom binge-watched on lazy Sundays, hiding behind the thick pines just in time to overhear her heated argument, spilling words like, "I told you it's handled." But if Tom finds out we're sunk, which sent my mind racing through a whirlwind of dark possibilities, from mounting unpaid bills to something far shadier tied to Frank's old associates who still occasionally mailed those yellowed collection notices I intercepted to shield Tom from more stress. She stormed back toward the group, dropping a crumpled receipt in her haste, which I scooped up later, revealing a rental for a storage unit in Madison dated just last month. And that night, as the bonfire crackled down to embers under a star-pricked sky, the tension escalated over slices of apple pie when Lisa casually announced they might sell their city place to start fresh, her eyes flicking nervously to Tom, who nodded along like a puppet on strings, pushing me to finally voice my nagging question about the necklace, only for her to laugh it away as me seeing ghosts from Frank's mistakes, which stung deeper than intended, since yes, his debts haunted our every financial decision, but that evasion didn't explain the undercurrent of deceit I sensed thickening the air with every uncomfortable shift from Tom. That growing itch for some kind of reckoning without exploding the whole fragile setup led me to my first bit of clever payback the very next morning. While she showered humming off-key pop tunes, I accidentally, on purpose, knocked her full coffee mug right onto her open planner spread across the kitchen table, watching the dark stains spread and ruin the page marked with a scrawled appointment for lawyer settlement talk at 2 in the afternoon. And when she emerged fuming, I played up the clumsy widow routine with a sheepish wink, blaming it on the sticky residue from last night's mores, but inwardly I relished the pallor washing over her face as she realized the damage might have obscured more than just ink, planting that seed of doubt in her perfectly manicured world. Little did I suspect that spill was merely the opening act, because as she snatched her keys and bolted out earlier than planned, muttering under her breath about getting rid of it tonight, my blood chilled at the implication, wondering what exactly she intended to dispatch into the lake's unforgiving depths that very evening. That barbecue revelation stuck with me like a splinter you can't quite dig out, turning every casual glance at Lisa into a mental replay of her tense whispers, and that damning storage unit receipt, which I had folded carefully into my apron pocket for safekeeping while pretending to fuss over the grill's dying coals as the neighborhood chatter wound down under the deepening twilight sky over Willow Lake, where the water lapped gently against the dock, as if mocking the undercurrents of deceit swirling through our family gatherings. Life at the lake house pressed on with its familiar rhythms of creaky screen doors slamming in the breeze, and the distant call of loons echoing across the glassy surface that had always symbolized a peaceful retreat from the world's sharper edges. Yet now every routine task, from folding laundry that carried faint traces of her citrus perfume mingled with an odd metallic tang reminiscent of nervous perspiration, to brewing morning coffee alone on the porch swing, felt laced with a growing unease that pulled me deeper into the puzzle of her secretive behaviors, even as I wrestled with the guilt of overstepping boundaries for Tom's sake, since he deserved a mother who supported rather than scrutinized his choices in this rocky marriage. Tom himself seemed buried under an invisible load during those following days, whistling half-hearted versions of the old folk tunes Frank used to hum while tinkering endlessly with the boathouse roof that desperately needed patching after last winter's storms. And I'd slip in light-hearted jabs over breakfast spreads of scrambled eggs and toast about how his workaholic streak mirrored his father's, to the point where he might soon be nailing stars to the sky, all while watching for any cracks in his forced smiles that hinted at awareness of Lisa's evasions regarding their city apartment's mounting upkeep costs, which she always attributed to the fluctuating real estate market, but never detailed beyond vague assurances that everything was under control. Humor served as my fragile armor against the absurdity of suspecting my own daughter-in-law of pilfering family history right under our noses, turning potential confrontations into wry observations shared with myself in the quiet hours, like chuckling over how her phone seemed hotter than a grill left unattended at a tailgate party, which prompted her to snap back once with a grin that never quite warmed her eyes by calling me the undisputed family comedian, though I sensed the barb hidden in her tone sharpening the conflict that simmered between us like a pot left too long on the stove threatening to boil over and scald everyone involved. The afternoons stretched into a haze of small-town normalcy interrupted by my heightened vigilance. Noting how Lisa volunteered with almost eager insistence for those supply runs to the nearby market, always returning with bags that appeared lighter than they should or excuses involving unexpected sales tax increases that didn't align with the receipts I glimpsed when she left her purse unzipped on the counter. And one particularly muggy evening as the sun dipped low, casting the lake in hues of burnt orange and rose that evoked postcard memories from simpler family vacations, we all settled into the living room for what Tom billed as a morale-boosting movie night. Featuring some frothy rom-com he swore would lighten the mood after the holidays' subtle tensions. That's when the first substantial twist unraveled in the midst of popcorn bowls passed around and the flicker of screen light dancing on our faces. For as Lisa excused herself midway to the kitchen, claiming a need for more butter, her absence allowed me to idly flip through a gardening magazine abandoned on the coffee table, only to dislodge a tucked-in photograph that fluttered to the floor showing her arm in arm with an unfamiliar man at what appeared to be a bustling casino in Las Vegas. The image timestamped 2 years prior, precisely when Tom had mentioned her attending a professional conference for real estate networking, sending my pulse into a frantic rhythm as I hastily slid it back, wondering if this stranger represented the voice from her overheard calls or some deeper entanglement tied to the financial whispers that haunted our conversations. Keeping my composure intact when she returned with the steaming bowl, I steered the evening's chatter back to neutral waters, discussing the fair's upcoming pie contest and the latest gossip from town about the new bait shop opening by the marina. But later that night, after Tom had dozed off on the couch with snores rumbling like an approaching thunderstorm, I cornered her by the sink under the pretense of helping dry the accumulated dishes from the snack frenzy, inquiring innocently about her travel adventures beyond the conference label she always stuck to, which caused her to freeze mid-motion with a dish towel clutched tightly before recovering with a laugh, dismissed as mere client schmoozing at a trade event, though the subtle tremble in her hands as she resumed wiping plates confirmed the evasion ran deeper than surface pleasantries. The atmosphere thickened palpably with that unspoken accusation hanging between us like humidity before a storm, her quick defense pivoting to Tom's so-called trust issues inherited from Frank's legacy of poor financial judgments, implying that I was merely projecting outdated family specters onto their modern attempts at building stability, which twisted the knife further, since yes, the debts from his hardware store's downfall still cast long shadows over our decisions, but her deflection only fueled the uncertainty clawing at my insides through restless dreams where the lake swallowed unspoken truths whole, leaving me to surface gasping for clarity amid dilemmas of whether to burden Tom with these fragments or allow the rot to spread unchecked, eroding the fragile harmony we clung to. By the next afternoon, with the sun beating down on the shore path during one of my solitary walks, meant to clear my head, the growing conflict demanded some form of action, though not the explosive variety that could shatter everything, so instead I resolved on a subtler approach, waiting until evening when the neighbors convened for their weekly card game at Mrs. Jenkins' cluttered bungalow, where the air filled with the shuffle of decks and aromas of fresh-baked cookies, whereupon I casually wove into the conversation a tale of spotting suspicious vehicles loitering around the lake access points, lately describing the make and plates of Lisa's car in passing, without directly naming her, which stirred just enough intrigued murmurs and sidelong glances to brew a pot of minor gossip that would reach her ears by morning without any direct trail leading back to me. She caught wind of it sooner than expected, overhearing from the doorway with her face draining of color before shooting me a glare sharp enough to slice through the evening calm, though I met it with a sweet smile over my hand of rummy cards, murmuring about simply watching out for our peaceful enclave dear, which delivered that witty sting of satisfaction as she excused herself, abruptly flustered and off-kilter, muttering something about an early night while the group exchanged knowing looks that promised ripples in the local whisper network. Such small revenges provided a temporary balm against the impending storm gathering force, yet as dusk enveloped the landscape that same evening with the sky bruising into deep purples over the tranquil water, I glanced out from my rocker on the porch, and there she stood in stark silhouette against the fading light. Lisa hauling a bulky suitcase down the winding path toward the lake's edge, her movements deliberate and weighted as though carrying burdens far heavier than mere luggage, prompting my breath to hitch in my throat as I pondered if this was the very it she had vowed to dispose of the muffled secrets, finally destined to plunge into the unforgiving depths below. Witnessing Lisa with that ominous suitcase poised at the lake's edge rooted me momentarily to the weathered boards of the porch, where the evening chill wrapped around my frame like an unwelcome embrace, seeping through the thin fabric of my sweater as if the very water below sensed the turmoil brewing and sought to draw me into its murky embrace long before I was ready to confront the escalating web of suspicions that had entangled my thoughts since the barbecue's revelations, with my mind flashing in rapid succession through the accumulating anomalies, from the pilfered necklace glinting accusingly in memory to the Vegas photograph's enigmatic stranger whose identity gnawed at the edges of my resolve, and the overheard fragments of her phone arguments that painted a picture of financial desperation far beyond what Tom had ever admitted during our strained conversations over late-night teas. She hesitated there for what felt like an eternity under the dimming sky, her silhouette etched sharply against the rippling surface that mirrored the fading hues of sunset in oranges and indigos, before swinging the bulky canvas object outward with a force born of desperation or perhaps calculated resolve, watching it arc gracefully through the air to land with a resounding splash in the shallows, where it bobbed briefly like a reluctant confession before beginning its slow, inexorable descent, stirring ripples that spread outward in ever-widening circles, as if the lake itself recoiled from the intrusion. And in that initial moment of observation, I rationalized it away as merely her theatrical method of discarding outdated remnants from their marital discord, since every couple weathered by time accumulates such baggage, whether in the form of forgotten clothes or symbolic trinkets meant to mark a fresh chapter. But then emerged that insidious sound, faint and muffled, akin to a stifled cough or the desperate thump of something vital struggling against confinement, bubbling up sporadically from the submerged mass, which slammed into my consciousness with the urgency of a trapped heartbeat, echoing the primal instincts Frank had always teased me about during our fishing trips, when I'd insist on checking every creel for overlooked minnows. Panic overrode any lingering hesitation as I bolted down the overgrown path, my slippers skidding on the dew-slicked dirt, while I called out her name in a voice that cracked under the strain of unbidden fear, only to find her already retreating toward her car with purposeful strides, the engine roaring to life moments later as tires spun gravel in a hasty departure, leaving me isolated on the shore with the encroaching dusk and that persistent intermittent noise rising from the water like a siren's call demanding intervention before silence claimed whatever secret lay within, compelling me to weigh the internal conflict tearing at my core between plunging into the cold unknown and risking the ridicule of overreaction, should it prove innocuous, or turning away to preserve the fragile peace at the cost of a gnawing what-if that could haunt my nights worse than the unresolved echoes of Frank's debts, which still arrived in sporadic envelopes I shredded in quiet fury to spare Tom further burden. Maternal protectiveness twisted toward this convoluted family dynamic ultimately propelled me forward, kicking off my footwear and wading into the biting chill that climbed my legs like icy fingers, numbing skin and resolve alike, before I dove fully beneath the surface, where the world muffled to a symphony of underwater murmurs and the burn of held breath as my arms propelled me through the opaque murk, fingers extended in desperate search, grazing tangles of submerged weeds and jagged rocks until they closed around the rough textured handle of the suitcase, which resisted my pull with a weight that suggested contents far denser than mere fabric and paper, demanding every ounce of strength honed from years of hauling dock lines and garden tools to haul it upward against the lake's reluctant grip. Emerging with a ragged gasp that sprayed droplets into the twilight air tasting of algae and ancient sediments, I dragged the sodden burden onto the pebbled bank, collapsing beside it as my chest heaved in rhythm with the pounding of my heart, the zipper partially corroded from the brief immersion glinting mockingly under the first stars pricking the canopy above, while that muffled vibration persisted, now more insistent, vibrating through the waterlogged material like an accusation refusing to be sending waves of uncertainty crashing through me as I pondered the possibilities ranging from a discarded pet in cruel abandonment to a malfunctioning device or, worst of all, something human deemed expendable in Lisa's shadowed world, which ignited a fresh dilemma of immediate exposure versus cautious retreat, knowing either path branched into uncharted territories fraught with potential fallout for Tom's already strained marriage. With hands trembling from cold and adrenaline, I attacked the stubborn fastener, clawing at the teeth inch by tortuous inch, the metallic scent of wet leather mingling with the earthy aroma of the shore until it yielded with a reluctant rasp, peeling back to expose the interior where, instead of the grotesque horrors my imagination had conjured, lay a tightly bound stack of yellowed envelopes secured by a faded ribbon that matched one from Frank's old desk drawer, the handwriting on the topmost missive curving in strokes eerily reminiscent of his own, addressed intimately to Lisa, with dates inscribed post-dating his death by years, implying an illicit correspondence that spanned beyond the grave and unraveled the foundational truths of our family's fractured history, suggesting betrayals that ensnared Tom in peripheral complicity, perhaps leveraging the persistent debts as tools for manipulation or coercion. The shock immobilized me there amid the mud and gathering mist, letters scattering slightly in the gentle breeze with phrases like "our shared future beyond the shadows" and "the funds we concealed from prying eyes," leaping forth like spectral indictments that tied Lisa's evasions to Frank's final desperate ventures, hinting at hidden accounts or forged claims that could drag us all into legal quagmires if unearthed, prompting a nauseating surge of betrayal mingled with the moral quandary of confrontation, now risking Tom's vehement denial and further isolation, or secreting the evidence away to ferment like the uncertainty that had already eroded my trust in their union. A dark thread of humor threaded through the turmoil as I envisioned Frank peering down with his trademark wry grin at the irony of his widow, literally fishing out remnants of his purported posthumous romance, turning what should have been a straightforward family rift into this submerged saga. Yet the escalating conflict necessitated retaliation, not in explosive accusations, but in calculated nudges. So after securing most of the bundle against my dampened sweater, I deliberately left one incriminating page loose within the suitcase's folds before driving through the enveloping night to their urban dwelling, where under the cover of unanswered knocks I slipped the prop into her unattended purse on the stoop, a sly insertion designed to unsettle her equilibrium upon discovery, making her question the inescapability of her submerged secrets in a revenge that whispered, "Your attempts at burial won't hold without a trace." As I navigated the winding roads back toward the cabin, headlights slicing through the inky void, one particular postscript seared into my memory, alluding to a shared secret originating from the hardware store's turbulent final days, which hinted at layers delving far deeper than the lake's surface, with Lisa's impending countermove looming like thunderheads massing on the horizon, threatening to unleash a deluge upon our precarious familial equilibrium. Those retrieved letters seared against my skin through the damp fabric of my sweater, all the way back to the lake house that fateful night, the ink's faint smears transferring like invisible brands as I navigated the twisting roads under a canopy of indifferent stars that seemed to wink at the absurdity of unearthing family phantoms from the very depths meant for peaceful reflection, leaving sleep a distant stranger as I huddled in the kitchen by the dim glow of a single bulb pouring over each envelope's contents, with a mix of dread and fascination that revealed Lisa not merely as an opportunistic outsider, but as a figure entwined with Frank's twilight years through promises of mutual escape from the crushing debts via a mysterious partner whose descriptions evoked her own sharp features, and whose allusions to concealed funds hinted at insurance maneuvers or offshore stashes that could either salvage or sink our remaining legacy, depending on how the threads unraveled further. Morning light filtered through the lace curtains, bringing Tom's routine check-in call, where his voice carried the casual lilt of normalcy, inquiring about weekend fishing plans, yet laced with an undercurrent of fatigue that mirrored my own unrest, prompting me to mask my turmoil behind affirmations of fine weather and stocked bait, while inwardly debating the wisdom of inviting them over for a family dinner to test the waters without prematurely unleashing the evidentiary storm brewing in my possession. since withholding the full scope felt like a morally ambiguous gamble, one that audiences peering into this tale might judge as enabling the deception through inaction born of fear that Tom himself harbored compromises in the shadows of their shared life. The evening meal convened in the cabin's familiar warmth, where the aroma of simmering pot roast infused with garden-fresh carrots and herbs wafted through the air, mingling with the faint mustiness of aged wood that had absorbed decades of Harlan gatherings. Yet now the atmosphere hummed with latent tension, like a taut bowstring ready to snap as Lisa picked tentatively at her portion, her usual vivacity subdued perhaps by the planted letter's unsettling reappearance, while Tom devoured his helping with the mechanical focus of a man avoiding deeper discourse, and I orchestrated the conversation along safer currents, discussing the impending county fair's quilt exhibits and the quirky new bait shop owner who claimed his lures could hook legends from the lake, before veering subtly toward mentions of attic discoveries in old photo albums, watching her eyes flicker toward the bulge in my apron pocket where the bundle rested secure. She parried with a fabricated anecdote about her Eastern roots and the car accident that claimed her parents young, tugging unexpectedly at heartstrings I preferred to keep fortified against her manipulations, but the true pivot arrived amid dessert's apple crumble when Tom offhandedly referenced a box of Frank's unearthed documents surfacing mysteriously at his construction site, containing ledgers etched with Lisa's name on postnuptial loans that suggested she had been bridging gaps in their finances through channels tied to his father's erstwhile business associates who vanished amid the store's collapse, leaving a trail of unresolved claims that now looped back to threaten their stability. The clatter of her fork against the plate shattered the fragile veneer as she whirled on me with accusations of sowing discord through planted doubts, her voice rising in a pitch that blended defensiveness with desperation, turning the room into a crucible where unspoken barbs flew like sparks from a whetstone, and I absorbed the assault with measured silence, my choice to withhold the letter's visceral proof now crystallizing as a flawed strategy, one that prolonged the agony yet preserved a sliver of control amid the dilemmas forking like the lake's inlets, whether to shatter the illusion outright and risk Tom's backlash, or nurture the suspicion to force organic confessions that might salvage some semblance of trust. Uncertainty swelled to suffocating proportions in the aftermath as the argument simmered into an uneasy armistice, with Lisa retreating to the guest room under the guise of a migraine, her footsteps echoing hollowly down the hall while I lingered in the cleanup, feigning normalcy by scrubbing pots with vigor that belied the storm within, and later, under the cover of delivering fresh linens, I rifled through her purse in a swift incursion, discovering the missing letter absent but unearthing a keychain from that Madison storage facility engraved with initials aligning eerily with the Vegas companions from the pilfered photograph, which ignited fresh quandaries of exposure versus solitary pursuit, knowing that delving alone positioned me as the narrative's potential antagonist in their eyes, yet inaction equated to complicity in whatever financial quicksand they tread. A wry undercurrent of humor pierced the gravity as I pictured myself transformed into a shoestring budget sleuth navigating Clue's insensible walking shoes, prone to tangles, much like the very ties binding us all, and by first light with Tom departed for an early site visit and Lisa vanished once more on nebulous errands, I conscripted Mrs. Jenkins' grandson, a lanky teen versed in digital sleights, to access her social feeds, not for outright sabotage, but a pinpoint insertion posting from her profile a cryptic status about family skeletons clattering in hidden closets, scheduled to mimic an inadvertent slip, thereby igniting neighborly buzz by midday when her frantic call arrived laced with denials and pleas for assistance in scrubbing the trace. My retaliation unfolded with feigned concern over the line, attributing it to rampant hackers in this tech-crazed world, dear, while inwardly savoring the disruption that left her scrambling to mend the digital fence, a clever non-confrontational jab that satisfied the vengeful spark without direct fingerprints, yet, as I concluded the exchange with assurances of support, the genuine precipice loomed when Tom's truck rumbled unannounced into the drive, his countenance pale as lake fog, admitting in halting confessions that he had glimpsed some of those old letters months prior tucked in her drawer, dismissing them as innocuous relics from a bygone liaison rather than the incendiary forgeries or truths they appeared. Yet his gaze implored restraint from further probing, and in that suspended moment her empty vehicle pulled alongside the cabin, Lisa nowhere visible, as if She had dissolved into the ether, leaving us staring at the vacant seat with the weight of vanishing presences pressing down like the gathering clouds over Willow's restless waters. Tom's halting admission lingered in the charged silence of the cabin's living room that tense afternoon, where the faint scent of cooling pot roast still clung to the air, mingling with the musty undertones of old wood that had witnessed generations of Harlan joys and sorrows, now overshadowed by this revelation of his partial awareness of the letters tucked away in Lisa's private spaces, which he had rationalized months earlier as mere sentimental artifacts from her premarital flings rather than the potentially forged missives or genuine indictments they now appeared to embody, tying her to Frank's final desperate maneuvers with business associates who had evaporated amid the hardware store's ignominious collapse, leaving behind a labyrinth of unresolved loans and claims that looped perilously back into our present entanglements, prompting me to press him gently for more details while he paced the threadbare rug, his hands twisting the truck keys like a rosary in distress, confessing that he had chosen silence to avoid reigniting the echoes of his father's financial follies, which had scarred our family so profoundly, yet his evasive glances betrayed deeper compromises, perhaps concessions made to preserve their union at the expense of full transparency, a choice that now positioned me as the reluctant arbiter in this moral quagmire where withholding the complete bundle felt increasingly like a paternalistic overreach, one that invisible observers might decry as meddlesome, enabling of half-truths born from an outdated instinct to shield rather than empower. As the hours stretched into a vigil of unanswered calls to Lisa's phone that rang into perpetual voicemail, the uncertainty morphed into a palpable dread, enveloping the cabin like the fog rolling off Willow Lake's surface, obscuring the familiar shoreline and turning every creak of settling beams into imagined footsteps, while Tom and I sifted through the letters anew under the harsh kitchen light, their yellowed pages unfolding layers of intrigue with phrases alluding to concealed insurance payouts or joint ventures and shadowy real estate flips that Lisa might have orchestrated, using her professional savvy to siphon resources toward settling her own inherited burdens from that tragic car wreck she had mentioned in passing during our fraught dinner the previous evening. Driven by the escalating impasse, we ventured out at dusk toward the Madison storage unit, the keychain's engraved initials serving as our dubious talisman clutched in my palm like a promise of clarity amid the gathering shadows, where with Tom's bolt cutters we breached the rusted lock, revealing an interior crammed with cardboard boxes that blended Frank's archive ledgers, stained with coffee rings and frantic notations, alongside Lisa's crisp real estate contracts marked with highlighted clauses for quick sales and escrow maneuvers, the true twist materializing in faded print across documents showing her systematic diversion of modest sums from their joint accounts, ostensibly to service liens tied to her family's past, yet leveraging the letters implied leverage to coerce Tom's complicity in floating the lake house as collateral for a larger bailout that would free them both, but leave me adrift in the ruins of our shared history. Revelations cascaded like the lake's sudden downpours. Emotions raw and unfiltered as Tom admitted his dread of confrontation, mirroring Frank's avoidance that had snowballed into catastrophe, and I confronted the sting of my own retaliatory pranks, from the coffee spill to the digital ghost post now seeming petty catalysts that may have accelerated her flight into this vanishing act, yet the ambiguity persisted, gnawing at the edges, whether the letters bore authentic traces of posthumous intrigue or stood as her ingenious fabrications to extricate herself from a marriage buckling under mutual deceptions, a dilemma that forced me to question if my protective meddling had amplified the fractures or merely illuminated paths toward reluctant healing. A thread of bitter humor wove through the heaviness when Tom quipped about our lineage resembling a traveling circus, complete with vanishing performers and trapdoor secrets, lightening the load just enough to navigate the return drive where headlights pierced the encroaching night, revealing Lisa's car parked crookedly in the driveway upon our arrival, her figure emerging from the tree-lean duffel slung over one shoulder, eyes wild with the disheveled intensity of someone who had fled not just physically but from the weight of accumulating lies, claiming in a rush of words that the social media blunder had unraveled her composure, prompting a solo hike to the far shore for perspective, though her narrative fractured under scrutiny, admitting the suitcase's submersion stemmed from sheer panic over The letters' potential resurfacing, fearing they would entangle us all in protracted legal battles stemming from Frank's era of poor judgments. The culminating confrontation ignited back at the cabin beneath the jaundiced glow of the porch light, where stars wheeled indifferently above the murmuring lake, serving as backdrop to voices escalating in a vortex of recriminations and supplications. Lisa's tears carving tracks down her face as she articulated the desperation of forging a life atop her orphaned past's rubble. Tom positioned agonizingly between loyalties, his pleas for understanding clashing with my steady recitation of the evidence laid bare on the scarred table, the atmosphere electric with the precipice of irrevocable rupture, yet laced with the poignant undercurrents of shared vulnerabilities that humanized even her deceptions. In that maelstrom of raw emotion, she unveiled the final pivot, asserting the letters derived not from Frank, but from his elusive partner's hand, complete with mimicked signatures intended as blackmail fodder over a naive co-signature on a loan from her youth that intertwined our debts into an inescapable snare, leaving me to ponder the futility of vengeance in such convoluted bonds where retribution risked mutual destruction rather than justice, and thus I orchestrated the decisive reprisal not through vitriol or summons, but by pressing the storage unit key into Tom's palm during a hushed aside from Lisa, urging him to pursue the sale of the property as a liberating severance, but contingent upon her unvarnished disclosure to all parties involved, a shrewd deflection that compelled her reckoning without my overt hand, watching her composure crumble as he assented, the satisfying resonance of enforced candor echoing like a distant bell toll. As their taillights receded into the enveloping darkness, carving paths through the mist-shrouded road, I settled alone by the water's edge, the ripples lapping at my feet in rhythmic whispers of unresolved queries. Had my interventions mended the familial weave or rent it asunder irreparably, and might those submerged secrets bob to the surface? A new bearing, please, we had long muted in the pursuit of uneasy peace, leaving the night to ponder forgiveness's elusive shores amid the lake's eternal ambiguities.